Welcome to the Skin Lab. This is Dr. Walla, and I'm going to give you a skin tour today. So there are three major layers of the skin. I guess I should start out by telling you something like, hey, these are the three major layers of the skin. I should also tell you some things like skin is an organ. It's also the largest organ in your body. And the skin cells on the surface are completely reproducing very rapidly. And every 30 days, your skin on the surface is replaced. So let's take a look at that part of this. The three major layers include the epidermis at the surface, where we see things like cells that we call basal cells. Which are also known as keratinocytes. Okay, and we also see some other cells in there, which are called melanocytes, which are more of a spidery shape that are in between these guys. All right, they look like this, and those would be called melanocytes. C-Y-T-E-S. Okay. Below that is a layer called the dermis. The dermal layer here has capillaries. It also has touch sensors, which I don't usually cover, but they're here in this level. There are also sweat glands, and there are sebaceous glands. Okay, so be watching for those things down there. And in the bottom, these are mostly going to be fat cells in the hypodermis. So that's what these things look like. Fat cells, these big like circular things that looks like you've cut into a cork or something. So we're going to begin our discussion today at the very top, where we're going to work with the epidermis. And so these cells start dividing along this layer they call the basement layer, which we don't deal with too much. The basement is this layer here at the bottom, the black line. And then above that are the adult stem cells that form the sort of keratinocytes. And then as they divide, their daughter cells move up. So you can see here, I'll put some little arrows, that as the cells mature, they sort of move further up, and as they get up further, they kind of break down. All right, and as they break down, they make this really weird layer that is broken cell membranes, but what's left is the material inside. And the reason they are called keratinocytes is because they produce a thing called keratin, which is a protein. And that protein is a waterproofer, and it's also a protector. And it makes up things like what's in your fingernails, for example, like nails and hair are all keratin. But how does the keratin get from inside a cell to be like your hair? Basically what happens is it secretes so much keratin protein. So you can imagine that single gene being transcribed to messenger RNA and then translated to transcribed to messenger RNA and then translated to protein, and then like having tons of that protein inside, and then the cell itself, when it sort of collapses, it makes this big keratin pile. I can write that in there like some cool puzzle, but it makes a big pile of keratin. And the same thing happens for your hair. It's keratin pressed together. Same thing happens for your nails. Lots of keratin there. And the cells are basically all squished together to form that structure that makes your fingernail. That means that if you want to do something like permanently, as these cells get to the top, they sort of drift off, right? They slough and they exit, slough. So that means that after, it takes about 30 days for that to happen, to go from the base all the way to the top, right? And so that means your entire skin on the outside of your epidermis is replaced about every 30 days. Probably key to this is that if you want to put a tattoo in your skin, if you put it on the surface here, so you want to put a little blue tattoo here, those cells are just going to fall off, right? So somehow you have to put the blue color down here in this area. In one of the videos we watched, they suggest that they actually put that dye down here in the dermis. I'm not sure how that would work exactly. My understanding is that we actually end up dyeing these cells right here, and they are the adult stem cells that make daughter cells, and some of the dye will go off in the daughter cells to become up to the surface, and that's why we see the tattoos sort of fading over time, but they're permanent because the dye is actually in the cells that aren't migrating to the surface. So that's interesting. Melanocytes. This is another type of a cell that are these, I mentioned these spidery things that are in here. They produce melanin, and melanin, actually there's several types of melanin, but we're just going to say melanin is UV protection. And that means that the sun's rays actually break up DNA, destroy it, and when that happens, your skin responds by having an immune response, by releasing histamines, increasing temperature and fluid, and you get a sunburn. If melanin is produced, it helps protect that DNA in the lower layers from the sun. So melanin is a very important production. It also makes the skin color darker. And what we see is that, and you'll see there's a nice video in D2L, you can learn about skin color there, that essentially the people that have darker skin don't have more melanocytes. What they have are melanocytes that are more active and they produce more melanin. And because the skin itself produces vitamin D, we actually produce vitamin D, is produced by the skin. You need a little sunlight. Sun plus skin makes vitamin D. You need that sunlight on there to make that happen. So if you get a little bit of sunlight each day or even some sunlight every week, you produce enough vitamin D. If you don't get enough sunlight, say you live in Siberia where it's dark 6 months of the year, you're not going to get any sunlight, and that means your body won't produce vitamin D, and that means that your bones will get soft. You might get rickets or osteomalacia, and your bones might bend because of a lack of vitamin D. The presence of the melanocytes and the presence of melanin actually makes it more difficult to make vitamin D because it filters out the UV light. So individuals that have light skin are thought to have ancestors that came from northern climates where getting as much light as possible was important, so they don't have a lot of active melanocytes, and so they could make more vitamin D, whereas in the equatorial regions where humans originally evolved, and the ancestors of all humans, probably had lots of melanin to protect them from skin cancer, which we'll also talk about. But they got plenty of light to make vitamin D, so that was never a problem. Check out the video to listen to that part. Okay, we're going to move on here to look at the... I should mention a couple of things. There are a couple of kinds of cancer out there that are going to be important. Basal cell carcinoma. And this happens in keratinocytes, right? Typically not dangerous. Usually localized, right? And if we look at the other side, we have malignant melanoma. Now, malignant melanoma comes from infected melanocytes. And when those get cancer, because of their unique sort of spidery shape and they have ways of moving between cells, and they're also very close to the circulatory system, they can get into the dermis. They can enter the dermis and then metastasize and travel around the body. So this is a very dangerous kind of cancer. So if you ask yourself, can you actually die of skin cancer on your ears? And the answer is yes. It's happened to people that I know, and it's real, so wear your sunscreen. Let's go take a look at the dermal area. The dermal area does have things like capillaries, which I'm not even going to try to draw. It's got these touch sensors down here, which I'm not going to draw either. But it's got two other kinds of glands, and one of them is sebaceous glands. And I'm just going to draw a sebaceous gland using my Well, let's go ahead and draw a couple of things that need to go in here. One of the things that need to go into this layer of skin, right, that we're in right here is going to be this, I'm going to change my color to black and continue across here. Draw this one out. And I'm going to go ahead and draw in a hair follicle. And what happens with the hair follicles, you might actually see that there's a hair growing in here. Yeah. Okay, and what you see there is a layer of cells that comes in and invaginates around that area and comes back out. So this becomes the hair, and this is the follicle. This is the hair follicle down low. But notice that the layer of tissue, we're kind of in the dermis layer. If you backed out and took a look, we're in the dermis, but actually the actual tissue here is actually epidermis. And that's because it's an epidermis that's sort of been invaginated down into the dermis. Okay, so down here you basically got cells with, in this area, cells with a lot of keratin producing the hair at the hair follicle base, all right? So that's still part of the epidermis, but it's in the dermal area, right? So let's go ahead and look at these sebaceous glands, and sebaceous glands are often associated with these hair follicles, and they would look something like this. And they kind of look like cottage cheese with a bunch of cell membranes. So that's going to be a sebaceous gland. You can take a look at some of the microscope slides to see what that really looks like, and that will be on your quiz. And then the other kind of gland that we'll see out there is called a sweat gland. And a sweat gland looks more like looks like this kind of thing. And we'll call this a sweat gland. Now, the sweat glands look different than the sebaceous glands because if you zoom in on them and you cut across, the sweat gland often ends up looking like this sort of thing, like a bunch of sort of macaroni. And the macaroni in slides is sort of like these fat little bean-shaped things, right? But that's a cross-section of that, and that is the how it looks in a slide. The sebaceous gland always looks like cottage cheese, though, so I'm just going to call it cottage cheese. Those are pretty easy to recognize. All right, now, what are they? Sebaceous glands, they secrete oil, right? And for moisturizing the hair, and sometimes they get infected, and if they get infected and you get inside this thing, we get a sort of a bacterial invasion that comes in there. And if it ruptures inside, then the bacteria actually get into the dermal area, right? And then you have a full-on immune response, and we call this acne, right? And so acne is basically a swollen, infected sebaceous gland. And isn't that what you wanted to hear? There's bacteria rupturing back into the dermal tissue where the capillaries are, so there's a lot of immune response. Can be dangerous to squeeze those because if they go into the capillaries, they can cause a blood clot that would end up in the brain or the heart somewhere. So best to use a hot compress and work to get them to emerge out this way and not internally to the dermis. The sweat glands themselves are pushing out mostly water and salts, a few other things that are out there. There is waste product in this area, but there isn't a tremendous amount of evidence that you actually move a lot of waste, like enough to be a purification rite. So most of the hot yogas and the hot experiences that people do to purify is just moving a lot of water out through your skin. But that's pretty awesome too. So let's take a look at what else we've got left here. Well, the fat cells would be down here at the bottom. So that covers the major structures of the skin and the major concepts here. If you look in your lab manual, you do have the A, B, C, Ds of skin cancer. And those are in the lab. And I should probably write those down on here so you can get them. A, B, C, D, E of skin cancer. And let's see if we can remember what all of these are. These refer to the shapes of moles on your skin, right? So these are skin moles. So asymmetrical. So if a mole is asymmetrical, which means it's not round, but instead is like this kind of shape, that would be asymmetrical. If the border is uneven, so if instead of being like a clear border like this, it has this sort of very uneven sort of border like that, that would be a bad thing. Color, if it's mottled, which means that, you know, it has areas in the mole that are actually like patchy in colors in different places, that would be not so good. And if a diameter, and I believe they use a diameter greater than 6 centimeters on here, which is pretty big, so you probably haven't missed any moles that are that big. And E refers to the topography. So if you have a mole that it looks like this on top instead of a mole that looks like that, that would mean that you should worry about that. Evenness, I think, is what that refers to. So, in any case, the ones that you should be worried about that might be related to early stages of cancers would be these things here. So that's something to watch out for. Protect your skin. It's the only skin that you have. And I think I've covered all the major aspects in